Hello everyone, my name is Kevin George and I'm the author of Soccology. I'll be taking part in the Own It Online Festival and I'll be doing a book reading of Soccology, giving you a brief of every chapter whilst explaining the scenarios and even touching on some of the things that didn't make the book. So I'm going to do a reading from the Soccology book. Now, this book is about the psycho and emotional elements of football, a place in football I feel which is untapped and which is the most important. So things like decision making is seen as the most important skill in football, but it's not developed. It's taken as a byproduct of what happens in training, but there's nothing actually specific that teaches you or allows you to develop it. It's almost just happens as a part of training and repeated experience. So also how mental health appears in football, social exclusion, etc. So I'm going to start off with the first chapter, which is State, which is my favourite one in terms of being most valuable in football. But I'm going to start instead of mumbling along. So I'm going to go to what state is. Your state is the condition you are in at a specific time, your way of being, your mood and your feelings arising from your physiology, thinking and emotions. The main way we experience and interpret the world around us is through our state. It can cause us to feel motivated or depressed and everything in between. And I think this is important because in football, a lot of the times we talk about confidence. This person's really low on confidence, this person's high in confidence. And actually, we kind of use confidence, even though that's the meaning, we stretch it across everywhere. And confidence is our judgment of our abilities. If I'm not good at golf, I hardly play it, but that's my judgment of my ability. Now, if I go to play golf and in terms of how I feel, maybe there's extra pressure around me, people are criticizing me, that's going to change how I feel and my capabilities will drop. My ability to play will be worse than how I judged myself and actually what I'm capable of. Now that's when we're talking about state. Now we're bringing the emotion in. So confidence, judgment, state, emotion. I think that's probably the clearest way to explain it. Okay, so let's hear a state story by one of the players, okay? Claudio Ranieri was good for me and he was happy to give me my break and play me. And over time, his confidence in me grew. He used to call me Rottweiler. So I'm laughing because I used to banter this player about this. I remember we had a game against Charlton in the league and he was going through the names of the players. When he got to the midfield, he said Gronkaya, Lampard, and instead of saying Nicholas, he said Rottweiler. Everyone was in absolute hysterics because of his accent and his use of the nickname. Looking back now, it was a clever psychological move. I think the reason he did it was to take the pressure off me as a youngster in the team, trying to solidify a career and prove I deserve to be there. It took pressure off the team as a whole because the game was important. Sorry, the game was an important one. We had to win to remain in the Premier League title race. The whole atmosphere in the changing room changed with that one joke. So throughout the chapter, there are some contributions from players sharing their examples of states and state change. That was by Alexis Nicholas, who was at Chelsea. He goes in to talk about Jose Mourinho, and also how Jose Mourinho did things that changed his state. We've got Willy Caballero from Chelsea, who shares his stories about when he was playing in Spain. And then we go into different types of states. So unresourceful states, resourceful states, high-performing states. And just to give you an example of the three, or I should say one of the three, a high-performing state is something that we may refer to as being in the zone. So a lot of players would have their rituals before the games, or we call them superstitions. Some players jump up and down, they start shouting, come on, and doing all that stuff. I was never that person, I was just quiet. But there are different things that people do. And something that's come out, well, I wouldn't even say come out, but people speak about more as being angry, how they utilize anger. So Zlatan Ibrahimovic spoke about this in his book. Wayne Rooney, it's known that Alex Ferguson would shout at him quite a bit and he would then be motivated even more. That was part of his motivation strategy. And he's got that famous Newcastle goal where he felt there was an injustice by the ref and he was arguing with the ref and then he goes and spanks in the volley, which is unbelievable. Would he have scored that go otherwise, I don't know. Obviously, we know he's capable. That's just a given. And there are other players who I work with who say the same thing. So that state, what we've got, unconscious competence. I've kind of bookmarked certain parts I want to speak about, but I'm going to have to freestyle it because I know it's going to be a madness otherwise. So just to give you an understanding, or actually give you some examples of what you may have experienced in terms of unconscious competence. So the first one I would say is when you were a toddler, even though you may not remember, or your child's a toddler, when they stand up, or you may have a sibling, you notice that they're focusing for the first time, and the first few times there's extreme focus. Their head is in that space. Everything goes into standing up until they get celebrations and see parents high-fiving, look, he or she's standing up. And then their focus moves from here, all the energy and focus here, to what the noise was, and then they drop. Now, after a period of time, they develop the ability to stand up unconsciously. So they pass that information back to the unconscious mind. And that's it still requires the same effort, even now, for me and yourself, but we just don't need to consciously think about it. And it's the same, the same process that happens where we pump blood around our bodies, etc. And then if you fast forward to driving, where if you're someone who did driving lessons and now have passed your test, what you would notice is when you get into a car, your head is in the car, it's in that space. So it's like steering wheel, brake, handbrake, etc. You're driving slow because your head's in the car and you're focusing. The more you drive, the more you can push it back to your unconscious mind. Now your head's at the bonnet, now your head's up the road. You passed your test, you can look and think, oh, actually, there's loads of traffic up there. I'm gonna take this turn in and, bypass the traffic. Now bring it into football. Again, young players playing, doing the basic drills, repetition, repetition, repetition. The more comfortable they get receiving the ball, passing the ball, then they can construct images in their mind. And we tell them to do it, but it's not just a case of choice. So now they're more comfortable in doing it because of the repetition. So their head, again, is in that space. The ball's coming, I need to focus on the ball, touching my foot, then passing it. The more I do it, now my head can be up. So I remember when I was younger, they would say, oh, get your head up. No, but I need to feel comfortable doing that. So it's like the child standing up, my head's in this space, or getting in the car. It's the same thing. I need to keep repeating the ball to my foot. Okay, now I can get my head up. Now I can construct images because I can see everything. So the unconscious competence is about managing information whilst doing the job, because we can only manage a certain amount of information consciously. All right, so using the example from an experienced player, this wasn't a quote given to me by this player, but this was actually in his book, and it's by Zlatan Ibrahimovic. It was like a dance, and even though I wasn't conscious of it, I dribbled past every one of the defenders and towed the ball into the net with my left foot. Example. So, and now those are his words. I wasn't conscious of it. So, let's go to the next bit that I bookmarked, but I can't remember why I bookmarked it. Aha! Now, this is an interesting one, and it's a player that played at Charlton with myself. And I'm going to read it to you first before I explain it. I played for England at youth level alongside my strike partner, Michael Owen, and went on to score goals in the Premier League. I'm one of only 5 people to score a hat-trick against Liverpool, but I didn't feel I really belonged until I was 29. Before that, I would play in the first team and do what I felt was required of me, but I wasn't scoring like I did in the reserves. Because I was a first team player coming down to the reserves, it felt as though I was helping them out. So I was able to just play like I was on autopilot. Sorry, I'm a bit cheesy. Ironically, a time I was able to do this in the first team was the week I got booed by my own fans. Why? Because I didn't give a boop. I stopped caring, I stopped thinking, and just played. Everything I did came off, and that was also the week I scored the hat-trick against Liverpool. First of all, so by the way, sorry, that was Kevin Lisby. Now, first of all, I experienced a similar situation in terms of how I was overwhelmed by anxiety. I felt like I was being micromanaged by my manager, and it affected how I felt and it affected how I played. So listening to that, it could actually go into state. Now, when you read this book, many chapters cross over, but as I highlighted, when Kevin spoke about not caring and he was unable to go into autopilot. He didn't interrupt the process. So even though we can develop skills where we're at a certain level of capability, where, you know, we're really good, we're flying, that process can be interrupted. And that's why I started off with state and said that state is probably the most important of the bunch, because regardless of whatever you do and how many times you practice, how you feel will interrupt that process. So Kevin's example was a perfect example of that. Okay, let me look at another bit that I highlighted. So now we look at stages of unconscious competence. Unconscious competence is a big deal. Look at what a player has to do from the second before they receive the ball to the second after they have possession. A total of 3 seconds. In that time, they need to visualize the different options open to them once they get the ball, so that they can select and apply the action in milliseconds. So before they get the ball, they're collecting data. You know, that defender looks like they're going to close my player down, or they might get sucked in, I can play him behind. You know, this one's next to me as like my safety option. You know what, there's a little gap there I might exploit and run into. Decide how to receive the ball. So they have to, you know, assess their options in their mind. Decide what to do with their first touch. And this is important because, especially on social media, you see players booting the ball up in the air and saying it's a great touch. I mean, you can, no, actually, let me not be extra. You can say it's a great touch, but I just find it interesting that we don't talk about touch variations and when they're needed. So I see some brilliant touches that I would class as brilliant because of the decision made, not necessarily the physical, the technical aspect of it. It could be a case of it's a real tight situation and they literally touch it so much that they get out of that situation, but so it doesn't go to another compromising situation. It was the perfect weight. So deciding what to do with their first touch is important. Being aware of space, so playing in between the lines. Being aware of their teammates, which I kind of touched on before in terms of when they construct their images. Being aware of their opponents, which I touched on. Assess the capability of their opponents. Now, when you look at some of the top teams, naturally, let me not go to the top teams. In our teams, we create a hierarchy. And so what will happen is there's that savior, that person that when we're in trouble, we're going to look to give it to more. We have to be honest, there are some teams or some players in your team that you don't rate as much. So you're not going to give them the ball unless you have to. It's something that people just do. And they get frustrated. So necessarily the physical, the technical aspect of it. It could be a case of it's a real tight situation and they literally touch it so much that they get out of that situation, but so it doesn't go to another compromising situation. It was the perfect weight. So deciding what to do with their first touch is important. Being aware of space, so playing in between the lines. Being aware of their teammates, which I kind of touched on before in terms of when they construct their images. Being aware of their opponents, which I touched on. Assess the capability of their opponents. Now, when you look at some of the top teams, naturally, let me not go to the top teams. In our teams, we create a hierarchy. And so what will happen is there's that savior, that person that when we're in trouble, we're going to look to give it to more. We have to be honest, there are some teams or some players in your team that you don't rate as much. So you're not going to give them the ball unless you have to. It's something that people just do. And they get frustrated. So what they do is they assess the capability of their teammates and they may decide, okay, I'm not going to give it to this one, I'm going to give it to that one. Or it might not be based on that, but in that situation. So if I know this person is really skillful, they can get out of any situation, I can just give it to them. Whereas if I feel that that's not their strength and I see them in a busy environment, I'm not going to give it to them. Okay, so select the weakest person to face in that scenario. So if I'm running towards a player or I'm going to run in behind a player, I'm not going to run in behind... I can't think of any current players to... Let me just bring it a bit old school. So for example, I'm going to run in behind Sol Campbell, less than I would run in behind John Terry. And that's just an example, because Sol Campbell is quicker. Yes, I know John Terry can read the game, but I'm just using that as an example. So I'll be assessing the capabilities of the player who I'm playing against. Select the weakest person to face in that situation. So I gave the example just then of a specific aspect, but there could be other ways I might judge the person as being a weaker part of their team and exploit them. Choose whether to dribble, pass, or shoot. Be aware of their different body parts, Coordinate the parts of their body. And sorry, when I say being aware of their body and coordinate coordinate the body parts, their body parts, I'm talking about myself. So, for example, as much as I'm looking at the ball coming to me, I'm visualizing the options and I'm looking at exploiting the other team, I have to still carry out the mechanics of my body. So fitness comes into play, because this is work and we don't notice it until we're tired. Also, injuries come into play in terms of mobility. That's something I'm definitely experiencing right now. So yeah, coordinating your body, executing that. Being aware of the ball. You know, balls come in, I'm constructing these images, those people there, managing my body, but I have to also be aware of the ball. It could be passed along the floor, it could be coming to me on the half volley, bouncing in the sky. You know, there's so many things I've got to focus on. Be aware of what will happen after they give the ball to a teammate. So personally, my responsibility isn't over until my teammate has controlled the ball in a safe space. Then it becomes their responsibility. And so what I mean by that is there could be someone marking them, but I have to make sure that I pass it to the safe side. I'm not just giving them the ball. Am I passing it to the foot that's the furthest away from an opponent? Am I passing it with the right weight? Am I giving them the right type of pass? Let's see which one I'm on now. So, think of the appropriate technique to use and how the ball will arrive to the teammate. Well, I kind of just went into that one. Select the technique. So now I know I've chosen which one I'm going to do. I've got to select it. I know of the options. I've got to select it. Think of which foot to use. Assess whether the ball is in the right place to connect effectively, because I may have assessed everything, run through all these ideas, and actually my touch has not been set up right. So I may have to now use option 2, or if I've got enough time, quickly shift the ball and go with the plan that I wanted to do. However, once I use an extra half second, that plan might not be as valuable now. And the last one is execute. So that is an example of all the things a player has to go through. All right, so what else? Without going in too deep with this, I go into training the unconscious mind, hopping between the two minds, because as much as I'm talking about unconscious competence and how great it is, you can't play the game unconsciously because there are things that happen in the moment. So the idea is repetition to sharpen your skill, but also to free up the conscious mind. Because prime example, if you have a player who has to watch the ball as it comes onto their feet, and they're looking at the ball as they dribble, which a lot of players do, I cannot be as effective as what I could be because my head's not up. I don't know what's going on around me. So I need to be able to have everything in place so unconsciously I can control the ball. Unconsciously, I can dribble with it. Yeah, I don't want to go into too much on that, but I think you get what I mean by between the two minds. Now, Willy Caballero, Chelsea's #1, shares this. Goalkeeper coaches use a lot of creative exercises from other sports. When other keepers and myself train, it's important that we know why we are doing the training, and it's important that we enjoy the training. For example, we do ping pong speed competitions where machines serve balls at you fast. This exercise is to develop our reactions. We then extend the level of difficulty by adding cognitive elements to increase our ability to think quicker in different situations. And again, that's just a way of developing unconscious competence, and something that Malcolm Gladwell refers to, thinking without thinking, to thinking quicker. And for a goalie, you know, they get balls smashed at them all day. And to be able to think, okay, that person's hit the ball and it's going there, and then I'm going to dive there, it's going to be near enough impossible. It's those snap reactions, and there's a lot going into that to be able to react and dive and save the shot. I'm not going to go into this, but Michel Brunings, who was credited, or who has been credited to revolutionising Belgian football, he does a bit on brain-centered learning. So I talk about this, and he's worked with some really, really big players that play for the national team right now. And that's unconscious competence. Okay, so I'm going to use a story from a defender who's a current player at Manchester United. He plays for under-23s, and he's an Italian international, and that's Luca Urcolani. For me, the game is about dominating your individual battles on the pitch. In my case, as a defender, it's my duty to dominate the striker. I feel that the start of the battle sets the tone, so I set out to give him a tough time and cause plenty of danger, and not the other way around. I want to intimidate the strikers I play against, so I try to look as big and as hard as possible and show no weaknesses. Even when I'm tired, I don't show it. How they see me is important, and it's equally important that I play the role that gives me an advantage. I'm always communicating with my teammates from my position on the pitch, and I purposely give arm signals to make my instructions clear and to show my opponents I'm alert. So he's now, yes, he wants to make sure the information he's giving his teammates are clear, but what I love is the fact that now he's actually communicating indirectly to the opponent as well. Even if he doesn't feel alert, he's kind of letting them know, look, I'm on it. As a striker runs towards me with the ball, the body part I take the most information from is the face. I can't say specifically what I'm looking for, but I assess every detail intensely for 1 to 2 seconds. That's enough time to give me an idea of what he's going to do. Then it's all about me with my extra bit of information against him, and that's my favourite part of defending. So Luca assesses the face, and I feel that you have some players who choose to cut off that information, and we love it. You know, Ronaldinho is probably the most famous, where he does the no-look pass. Now, I'm just assuming that if you spoke to Ronaldinho about this, I don't think he'll say, do you know what, I'm cutting off the information. But I think if we really chunk down on that, that's what it's about. And, I'm waffling a bit now, but you get what I'm saying. So it's something that we use in the game. Players all around the world love it. They do the no-look pass, but what's it really about? And there are times where you might not do the no-look, but you actually just look in one direction and purposely pass that way, because you're trying to throw off the other person. So some people may think, well, if this is being done, why are we even speaking about it? Why is it of value? Well, because we don't know to the depth of which we do it, or how in different ways we do it, and we only know the surface. So if it's something that we know more depth to, then when you're coaching someone, you can actually speak about it and really dig deep, and it's something they can develop, they can focus on it, and so that I'm going to use the term in terms of more intelligent footballers, because in that space, for some of them, it comes naturally. The ones who aren't as intelligent, they can actually learn. They know what they're focusing on. It's like in class, in school. Some people, you're going to have people who are more advanced in one subject, someone not so much. But the ones who are not doing so well in that subject, the teacher will give them certain things to focus on to bring them up to speed. And it's the same thing in football. We kind of, again, we just say, oh, you've got to work on this, repetition. But actually, if we be more specific on what to focus on, then we can develop that area specifically. I don't think there's anything else in that chapter. I go into the motherboard of a footballer and NeuroTracker, something created by Professor Jocelyn Faubert at the University of Montreal, and he contributed quite a lot to this chapter as well. And it looks at developing the unconscious mind and managing the information. NeuroTracker is really good for that. Southampton have bought into it, and funnily enough, when I interviewed Professor Faubert, The next day I was working at Southampton and they had it and I used it. The video's on YouTube somewhere. I know Manchester United have invested quite heavily into it, and there were talks of another club potentially buying it, but I'm not going to say because I don't know if they did. But yeah, that's that. Mind, body and eyes. Take the example of a country's football teams. Italy are known for being defensively astute. Brazil are known for being skillful. Spain and Holland are known for being technical, and England are known for passion. A country's culture outside football affects the culture inside football. Culture changes the lens through which we view the game. During his playing days, former Barcelona and Spanish international Xavi Hernandez talked about the contrast between the football culture of England and Spain. He said that when former Liverpool and England international Jamie Carragher won the ball and booted it into the crowd, he got a round of applause. Whereas in Spain, you would get nothing. It raises an interesting question. What conditions did Jamie Carragher meet to get a round of applause from the English fans? Why would he have got nothing from the Spanish fans? Now, what I then do is I'm going to go into is conditions of worth. And this is outside of football. Airline company Korean Air suffered 5 crashes in an 18-month period during the late 90s. Author and researcher Malcolm Gladwell believes that thousands lost their lives not because of any fault with the planes, but because of the specific behaviour of people in the moment. Behaviour that identifies as being part of South Korean airline culture. Recordings of cockpit conversations just before the crashes happened were examined. The co-pilots could be heard identifying dangers ahead in an unassertive manner, making suggestions and in some instances offering different options. Gladwell points out that Korean pilots do not speak assertively to their superiors, which was why, in his view, co-pilots in the cockpit at the time of crashes either withheld information or delivered it submissively. In support of Gladwell's view, a study of cultural psychology ranks South Korea second in the world for respect for authority, otherwise known as power distance. Power distance has its pros and cons, but in the cockpit, the cons far outweigh the pros. The problem was improved by recruiting people who had different cultural behaviours, who re-educated those who took part in power distance, and taught them English, a non-hierarchical language. Power distance can also apply to football. In certain cultures, if players have too much respect for a person they consider their superior, it can affect the development and growth of the team. Now, this plays out with individual players from around the world who are seen as the main player, overly aggressive, and it's quite contrasting in terms of what we put out there, what a player should be. You know, you should be humble, but actually there has to be another side to you, I think, to survive as a pro, but also to be at the top, right? So now, just putting that aside, going back to the cultural aspect and looking at what Xavi Hernandez was talking about with regards to, you know, the conditions Jamie Carragher met to get that round of applause, and then looking at the power that culture has outside of football when we look at the planes crashing and the hierarchy, how it plays out and how it affected behaviour. We're going to go over to Turkish football. Now, this is from Colin Kazim Richards, who's a Turkish international, and he's played in loads of different countries, but we're going to hear about it now. So far, I have played in England, Greece, Turkey, France, Holland, Scotland, and Brazil. Turkey's culture off the field holds back their performances on the field. In Turkey, people refer to those older than themselves as abi, meaning big brother or elder. In Turkish football, the players refer to their main player or the guy who earns the most money as büyük. I'm hoping I'm saying that right, which means big abi. If he, the big abi or the abi, messes up on the pitch, his lower status, lower earning teammates will not challenge him. Technically, Turkish players are unbelievably good, but the power of the abi holds back Turkish football. You only have to look at the Turks in Germany and Holland compared with those in Turkey. They're all Turkish, but the culture they grew up in is what was different. In the culture they grew up in was different, and this is what allows their talent to show. The likes of Mesut Ozil, Emre Can, and Cech Tosun, I don't know how to say his name, flourished in Europe, and they are German Turks. Yes, the development from a physical aspect may be better in Germany and Holland, but in football, the physical can only get you so far. We talk about leadership from the perspective of the manager and the player and how important it is. RB is about overpowering leadership and a misuse of power. Cultural politics holds Turkish football back. If you have a problem with the coach or don't play well, that's it. You have to train alone. You might not get paid your wages. I remember having to train alone in random training spaces with limited facilities at random times. If I refused to go along with the punishment or question their rule, it would result in a heavy fine or my wages being withheld. So again, it's looking at Colin Kazim Richards touching on the difference between Turkish culture and other European countries. And yes, infrastructure plays a huge part in the development of Turkish people in, say, Germany. But when we look at the power of the RB, that culture and that misuse of power affects the players, the rest of the team. Now, when we look at culture, and I'll go back and I explain this in more depth here, but I look back to when I was younger, I don't remember seeing Terry Butcher play, but I saw the image of the bandage around his head with the blood so many times. And then when Paul Ince had the similar bandage across the head and the blood when England had that important game in Italy, so many times. And then I would see English players punching the air and shouting, and these were the images being used so many times in the press. And I felt that there was a certain expectation to meet these conditions as an English player. It was about passion. Everything was about passion, passion, passion. And that overrode the other elements of football. And so the people that watched football, that was their expectation. They needed to see passion, and they needed to see it in a certain way, because you can be passionate about football and be someone who's like a number 10, but you're not going to be passionate. But you might not be passionate in doing a tackle. So people will criticize you if you didn't do it in a particular way. And so coaches, again, who are brought up in this country, so I'm being tongue-tied this morning, but coaches who are being brought up in this country will also have that lens to view the game. So then what is the impact of that? So if that's our culture in England, what happened? So I've got a heading here called Losing Our Artists. Because they do not meet the conditions, so we also lose creative and technical players who change their style to survive under those conditions. That's why there are so few creative players in England. Overcoming the culture is really difficult. Growing up in England, I genuinely believe that people who grew up in other countries were better footballers because it was common to hear, "Who do you think you are?" Insert the creative foreign player of that time. So, who do you think you are? Ronaldo? Who do you think you are? Figo? Who do you think you are? Who do you think you are? Who do you think you are? And so I would think, okay, well, basically, indirectly, what they're saying is, we don't do that here. And this wasn't about me personally, by the way. This is people that played around me who I believed at the time were really good players. And it was common. It wasn't one-offs. And I'm sure people who are watching this now, you'll experience the same thing. Anyway, so they would hear that anytime a player tried to express themselves creatively, creative expectations were limited and passed on like hand-me-downs. Just as kids in school seek praise from their teachers, young players seek praise from their coaches, because the more your coach praises you, the better your chances are of starting in the team, earning a contract and progressing through the system. In short, meeting the conditions leads to you meeting your dream as a footballer. Scott Parker had a very good career, starting at Charlton, earning moves to Chelsea FC, Newcastle United FC, West Ham United FC, Tottenham Hotspur FC, Fulham FC, and 18 appearances for the England senior team. Parker started out as a technical player who worked more with the ball than without it and produced brilliant performances. Performances that led him being rated as one of the best young players in the country and representing England youth from under 16 to under 21s. and then obviously progressing into making his 18 appearances. I remember when Parker was in the Charlton reserves, entering the final stage of his rehab, and he trained with the youth team that I was in. Technically, he was on another level, on the cusp of the first team. My teammates and I could not understand why he wasn't a regular in the first team. In fact, most people couldn't understand in the club. He was rated as one of the best in the country for his age group and a regular for the England youth teams, yet he struggled to hold a regular place in the Premier League for new boys for the Charlton first team. Sorry, I meant to say the Premier League new boys. The rumour in the Charlton training ground was that the manager told Parker he needed to tackle more if he wanted to be a first team regular. So there were so many rumours flying around the training ground. I remember there was that, and I think John Soccology pulled him, you know, and saying, you know, you need to tackle more. It was just so many. It was almost like being in like American high school, like Saved by the Bell. So I didn't really know what was facts, even when writing this book. So I thought, let me reach out to one of the players in Scotty's age. So I spoke to John Fortune. So this is the story which contrasts all the rumours that I heard in the training ground. I had the pleasure of playing with Scott Parker from youth to reserves and the first team at Charlton. He went from being one of the best number 10s in the country at youth level and reserves, and scoring goals, creating goals on a regular basis, to being one of the best defensive midfielders in the Premier League, breaking up the opponent's attack week in, week out. Parker's transition from number 10 to defensive midfield didn't happen smoothly. While on the brink of the first team, it was difficult for Parker as a number 10 to fit into the 4-4-2 system that the first team played. So our first team manager at the time, Alan Kirbishley, told Scott that he needed to be more like Mckenzie, a more rounded player that tackles more and is involved in the whole game. Then, former Crystal Palace legend Mark Bright was playing for Charlton at the time. Bright took Parker to an Arsenal game. At the game, they bumped into former Manchester United legend Paul Ince. Bright told Ince that Parker was the future of Charlton. Ince asked him where he played, and Parker replied, he played number 10. Number 10? Number 10? You need to be like me, running up and down in pitch, tackling, scoring goals. None of this number 10 rubbish. That was Ince's sharp response. Some could argue, well look, he had a great career and he was amazing as a holding midfielder. But the reason why I use this example is because there are many Scott Parkers out there that drop out the game or convert their game. So we have loads of guys that can do that job, but we lose the artists. And I saw this talk on Sky Sports the other day with Carlo Ancelotti, and about him having to change his system at Juve to accommodate Zidane. And he spoke about different ways he changed his formation. So I'm not saying Scotty was Zidane, but we never know what he could have been for one. But I'm using that as an example of managers changing systems and not being rigid to a system. And this isn't a criticism of Curbs. It's just me saying, look, at the end of the day, that we are losing players. And I feel that maybe if he was in Spain, that wouldn't have happened. Maybe even if they were playing 4-4-2, he would have found a way of being in there and being utilised and maximising his capabilities. Let's see. So what I do is, again, I go further into this. Oh, actually, I'm going to tell this bit. I think this is really powerful. Okay. As a result, Parker tackled more, a whole lot more. In fact, his game became all about tackling. He established himself in the first team, earned moves to some of the biggest clubs in England, along with 18 caps for the national team. How many Scott Parkers have there been in England? I know loads. Players have either dropped out of the game or changed to meet the conditions, which I kind of touched on. When explaining why it's difficult for a British player to win Ballon d'Or, or the Ballon d'Or, an award traditionally given to the most creative players in the world, former Everton midfielder Leon Osman spoke of the cultural expectations British players have. Osman said that he would not let a British player stand around doing the nice stuff. He would demand that they join in with the team and share the workload, because that's what you're expected to do as a British player. He also explained that when British players work as hard for the team as they are expected to, they lose their flair and all the individual skills that they could bring to the game. Things that set players apart from the rest. All right, am I going to go into the other stuff? So what I then do is I just go into a breakdown in terms of how we're slowly transitioning and how actually there's a room for everyone. So you had the England World Cup winning team, you had Tashan Oakley-Booth, and you had Phil Foden. Both technically very good, but Tashan is the bigger player, Phil is the smaller player. I think Phil Foden years ago would have been that player that everyone would have spoke about, who would have known him and said, oh my God, he's amazing. But the clubs would have said, you know what, you're too small. But Phil won World Player of the Year at the World Cup. And I don't need to talk about how good he is. So it just shows that we've always produced young, good players, but if they didn't fit our conditions in terms of how we saw a player, how they should be and how they should behave and having certain attributes, then they just couldn't make it. So, I won't go into this, but there's another bit where a heading which is behind the contrast in culture. So I talk about Steve McClaren when he goes to manage FC Twente, and he speaks about a team, one of his players coming up to him and speaking to him about the tactics and way he should approach the game. And McClaren spoke about English players not doing that. But I felt that the reason why English players wouldn't do that is because they've not been given the space to do that, not because they're not capable. And McClaren went out to Holland to coach after England, managing England. So he would have managed Rooney, Gerrard, Lampard, etc. So those guys know football. They would have been more than capable to speak about systems and things like that. But in England, it's more about command and control. And I think from a young age, if you create a space where they are free to contribute, then they will step forward and do that, you know. And I'll give you a funny story. I was playing non-league in England, and there were times when I would voice my opinion, and my friend Gavin Tomlin would say, look, what's the point in you speaking? Because, you know, they ask for your opinion, but they're not interested. Just don't do it, whatever. So I was playing for Stainstown, and we were playing against Eastleigh, I think it was, and we'd lost. We got battered, say 4-0. So I was fuming. Everyone's fuming. Manager's gone straight in the changing room. And I believe that my teammates, they hid behind hard work. Our problem was what we did with the ball, but they always said, oh, we didn't work hard enough. And I would get frustrated because I think, you're just hiding behind that, like you're hiding on the pitch. So anyway, got in the change room, but as we're going in, I said, look, no one say anything about hard work. We get in there, first player's like, oh, we didn't work hard enough. So I'm like, oh. So my manager at the time, I'm not going to say his name because I don't want to embarrass him, but he's like, yeah, you're embarrassing. So he's gone, you got anything to say for yourself? So I've gone, yeah, I have actually. And then at the corner of my eye, I saw Gavin, who was like, and I've gone, you know, we train with one floodlight. We're expected to keep the ball on a Saturday, but we don't do any keep ball. We pretty much, because of the one floodlight, we can't see anything. And so how are we going to develop in that area? And then as I'm talking, I realised something just came in my head and said, like, what's the point? I said, oh, actually, you know what, don't worry about it. And he goes, go on. So I was like, all right then. And as I went to say something else, he went, shut up. I can't say the word, but he swore and he's like, basically, shut up. So there's not that space. And yes, that's an example. But culturally, that's just something that we just don't have here. It's, if things don't go well, we curse. And if they do go well, it's kind of like, well done lads, we're doing this, we're doing that. But it's a clear positioning of Gaffer team. In his late teens, Tottenham Hotspur's utility man Eric Dyer played in Portugal with Sporting and in England with Everton. Although an England international, Dyer calls himself a foreigner when it comes to playing football in the English top division. In an interview with the Guardian newspaper, Dyer gives his definition of a good player, stating that for one thing, they would be able to acknowledge mistakes and correct them for themselves. Values he learnt growing up in Portugal. Dyer describes the contrast between England and Portugal. In Portugal, the coach sits on the bench and doesn't say a word, while in England, coaches tend to shout at players when they make mistakes and talk them through the game, which takes away their independence and stops them from learning from the experience. This is not how all coaches in England behave, but I do agree with Dyer that it's common. When I went to Holland to watch Vitesse Arnhem versus Abuja under 16 in 2015, I remember being shocked at how comfortable the coaches were and the people on the sides were. It actually made me uncomfortable, which is weird. So people were giving the ball away. It wasn't happening often because technically they were just on another level. But I just saw the coach, he was leaning like on the bench, just cash. And I'm so used to hearing some noise and the parents on the sideline maybe moaning and criticising the players and being jealous because someone's probably being progressed more than their son and blah, 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 blah. But I'm so used to that here that I felt uncomfortable with that contrast in Holland. So yeah, I then go into why Brazilians are the most skillful. So looking at the components of their culture which allows them to be more skillful. Yeah, I think that'll be it for culture actually. I don't think I'm going to go into any more. So yeah, that's it. Culture. Okay, so we are on chapter 5 of the Soccology book, and that's mental health. So in this chapter, players share different parts of their biography which fit along the spectrum of mental health. So illness, everything in between, and wellness. So it starts with Mckenzie talking about where he tried to take his own life and the injury that kind of was a trigger, and him breaking down, crying, and people in the club just kind of just walking past, ignoring him, not because they didn't like him or because they were bad people, but it was more because they didn't know how to react. Anthony Gardner spoke about, again, injury, how it led to him feeling depressed, affected his marriage, and a lifestyle that wasn't ideal for football, going out partying, which it was interesting me hearing God speak about this because I was out with him partying, so me seeing him out going, hey! and not realising what's beneath all of that. And how, other people, whether it be press or fans, they see players like that and think, look at them, or they got a bad attitude, or they're not serious, and all this other stuff, but they don't understand what's beneath it all. Now, in this chapter, the first bit I'm going to read is from the heading banter cycle and how that affects people in football. So, banter and practical jokes play a prominent role in football. It's how a player survives the furnace of pressure, prevents themselves from being the victim of somebody else's teasing, and counters the boredom of waiting around at training grounds and airports. The joking around that happens at football clubs is miles outside the boundaries found in other professional environments. There isn't much some players wouldn't do for a laugh, like young players squatting on top of the toilet and catching their poo to use against their teammates, or a 12-year-old player secretly peeing in his teammate's Lucozade bottle and then watching him drink it. So the player catching his poo, I remember hearing this story before I went into the building full time at Charlton, and the 12-year-old was me now working as doing my consulting and doing the programs at clubs. When I heard that story, it surprised me because I knew of all this, shall I say, this level of banter happening when you went full time, so from 16 plus. But when this 12-year-old shared that, I was like, wow. But saying that, nowadays, at that age, they are kind of full time in terms of how many times they're in. So I go to the clubs around the country presenting a program, and it's called The Grey Area, which covers the differences between banter and bullying. No matter the league, age group, or part of the country, when I ask people if they've ever been angry, upset, or sad, or if their performances have been affected negatively as a result of banter, you get this, oh, I'm cool, man, we're cool. I'm cool. Now, this is a time where I say to them, look, I expect you to be honest, and because I expect you to be honest, I have to be honest. And I say, I don't believe you. I said, I've been in changing rooms for years, so I know how they operate. Now, but yeah, I'll carry on. There are players that love the banter, but there are players that hate it too. Eventually, someone in the pack will say something which gives me an insight into what really goes on in the change room. As soon as they do, I home in on it and I explore it. And that's when they begin to open up, sharing the comments that are made and their opinions of them. Words like frustration, anger, loss of confidence and stress come into play. And this is where we explore the banter cycle. So, and this is comments. As I said, I always say, look, I don't believe you and this is why. And they're not really going to say, look, this affects me straight away because, you know, people in general, and even more so men because of the social pressures. And then on top of that, footballers are so used to being guarded anyway. But when I start asking a few questions or we do activities, but mainly in the questions, they give me something to hook onto. And as soon as they give me that, bingo, like we're literally exploring and we just start opening up. Soccology book, and that's mental health. So even though it's mental health, there's elements of emotional literacy there in terms of players understanding their emotions, but it's just called mental health. Now, we get players contributing different parts of their biography, from mental illness to wellness. So it starts off with Mckenzie sharing him breaking down crying after suffering another injury and later trying to take his own life. Also the discomfort around his teammates seeing him cry because no one actually came to speak to him. And then Anthony Gardner sharing injury and how it made him feel as well, and how it affected his mood. He felt depressed, affected his marriage, and also led him to a lifestyle that wasn't conducive to him being a footballer. You know, he was out partying. And for me, it was interesting speaking to guards about this because I was out partying with him. So, you know, I'd be seeing him out, hey, partying, not knowing, obviously, what's beneath all of that. And so fans and the press would see these footballers and be thinking, well, look at them, or, you know, their team lost, or what are they doing? And all these judgments come out, but they don't know what's beneath all of that. Now, I'm going to read a part that is under the header, The Banter Cycle in the Mental Health chapter. Banter and practical jokes play a prominent role in football. It's how a player survives the furnace of pressure, prevents themselves from being the victim of somebody else's teasing, and counters the boredom of waiting around at training grounds and airports. The joking around that happens at football clubs is miles outside the boundaries found in other professional environments. There isn't much some players wouldn't do for a laugh, like a young professional squatting on top of the toilet and catching his poo to use it against his teammates, or a 12-year-old player secretly peeing in his teammate's Lucozade bottle and then watching him drink it. Everyone accepts it on the surface, but how does it really affect people? Now, I was working at a tournament of professional teams, so I was working with different teams, and when this player, this 12-year-old shared that, I was in shock because when I was growing up, it was like, that happened when you went full-time, so from 16 onwards, and I would hear about the older players and they're doing certain stuff, but at 12, I was thinking, wow. And maybe that has something to do with that when I was coming up, if I was in a pro game at 12, I would only train twice a week and play on the weekend, whereas they're training a lot more. So in a way, they are kind of full-time. Okay, I go to clubs around the country presenting a program called The Grey Area, which covers the differences between banter and bullying. No matter the league, age group, or part of the country, from 16 onwards, and I would hear about the older players and they're doing certain stuff, but at 12, I was thinking, wow. And maybe that has something to do with that when I was coming up, if I was in a pro game at 12, I would only train twice a week and play on the weekend, whereas they're training a lot more. So in a way, they are kind of full-time. Okay, I go to clubs around the country presenting a program called The Grey Area, which covers the differences between banter and bullying. No matter the league, age group, or part of the country, when I ask people if they've ever been angry, upset, sad, or if their performance has been negatively affected as a result of banter, the response is always the same. I'm cool, or we're cool. And it's like these little ad-libs. I'm cool, yeah, we're cool, I'm cool, I'm cool. Because banter is a playful way of teasing, it is often difficult to see when it crosses the line and offends someone. While some topics are seen as obvious no-go areas, the only person who can truly judge whether the banter is offensive or not is the person it's being directed at. Why don't the ones that hate it say anything? Often it's because once a player does build up the courage to talk about how he is negatively affected by banter, his teammates laugh at him. No wonder people stay silent. They're going to be laughed at if they say something and laughed at if they don't. It's very common that when a player shares in a session that they have been negatively affected by banter happening in the change room, it is the first time the person's teammates have had any idea about how they truly feel about it. He was 12. It was under 13s team, Premier League team up north. And when I asked the questions about if banter affects them, you know, it was like, oh, no, we're good. We used to have a problem. They almost like they want to give me something. So I said, yeah, we used to have a problem. And then when I said to put your hand up, three people put their hand up. And when I signalled for one of the guys who put their hand up to talk, he just burst out crying. So, and the room changed. Dead silent. This was a group, very jokey, very lively. You could hear a pin drop. So I go in to explain that in a bit more detail, but not too much, obviously protecting the young person and not saying the club. Marcus Gale shares his experiences growing up at Wimbledon, the Crazy Gang. Owen Price shares his experiences at Tottenham Hotspur, playing under coaches. We didn't use the coaches' names, but going into, so he got bought from Charlton, and he was in a position of where his coach's son played, and how that affected him, because these coaches would talk about him negatively in front of other players, so it would get back to him. So managing that. Oh, and there's a heading called Problems, Pressure and Performance Anxiety. Now, I spoke to Dutch international Bart Ramselaar. So at the time, Bart was at PSV Eindhoven. So they had bought him from FC Utrecht. And he spoke about still accessing the coach that was there that really helped him. And he talks about just like the role of family. Now, an interesting, well, they're all interesting, but some parts that came up and that were quite contrasting was when I caught up with Gail Clichy. Gail spoke a lot about Arsenal and about Bergkamp and Vieira and their mindset and how they helped him to manage the pressures of playing at the top level and their attitude to being there. I'm not going to give you that because you have to read that bit in the book. You have to get that. But also how he takes up yoga nidra, which is a form of meditation. Because when we talk about mental health, we get caught up in illness to the stage where people say, oh, that person's got mental health. And I'm like, yeah, we all have. But yeah, so he talks about playing against Barcelona. You know, that was, I think, the first match after he started his yoga, and how his performances have just spiked. So we look at the wellness aspect. We also have Fabian Delph speaking about his experiences, and Danny Guthrie. And again, Danny Guthrie's part was linked to injury, but it was really powerful talking about him not trusting his body. And it's something that I did a piece with Sky Sports on this the other day, and it's really important that we don't speak about that actually. So under the heading Injured Heart, Injured Mind is Coutinho, when he was at Liverpool and he was trying to move to Barcelona. And it came up that he was injured. And I'll be honest, probably like most of you, I was thinking, oh, he's give it that one. He just don't want to play, get himself injured before he can move. But there was an interview with one of his friends who's, and I explained it in finer detail in here, but a friend who's a physio at one of the pro clubs in Brazil. And what he was basically saying was that his back injury was caused due to the stress of what he was going through at the time. So sometimes we look at mental health as separate from, you know, how it affects our performances, and this kind of bleeds into state in a way, that his mental condition actually brought on an injury in his body. And I think that could be mental health actually. Yep. Okay. Bada bing, bada boom. Leadership in the Soccology book. International businessman and food expert Clarence Francis's philosophy of management is that you can buy a man's time, physical presence, and a measured number of skilled muscular motions per hour or day. But you can't buy enthusiasm, initiative, loyalty, or the devotion of hearts, minds, and souls. You have to earn these things. when you look at leadership across different sectors, it begins and ends with the same thing: people. Leadership happens in all kinds of relationships, including those you have with your parents, teachers, and sports coaches. Your feelings about the way they lead you will affect your performance in those different environments. Your behavior at home, your success in a particular subject, and your performance in sport. The same is true in the workplace. Whether you work in the corporate world or the football world, leadership governs performance. Every season, all the teams at the bottom of a league have similar budgets and players, and the same goes for those at the top. Once you get past monetary resources, what remain are human resources. These are the most valuable because they can help a team stretch past financial constraints, use human resources well, and you can exceed expectations. Use them badly and you can stifle potential. And I go into the example of the corporate world because I've always looked at leadership in football universally, but it's strange because it was a gated community and it's slowly loosening up. So what I did is, when I was writing this chapter, and to get the point across, I spoke to Tim Payne from KPMG, who's a senior partner, and it was quite interesting listening to the things he spoke about, because they actually fitted in line with Arrigo Sacchi's approach, and it's actually quite comical. I'll read this bit. So when I speak about Arrigo Sacchi, it's under the collective intelligence heading. So I'll explain who he is for those who don't know. In 1987, Arrigo Sacchi became the manager of AC Milan. At the beginning of his reign, the Italian media cast doubt over his ability to manage one of the most talented teams in the world because he himself had not played at the top level. In response to the Italian press, Sacchi stated that he didn't need to be a horse first to be a jockey. Sacchi went on to transform the way Milan played, and to this day, the world continues to debate whether or not his Milan team were the finest football team that ever existed. And what I then going to explain is his philosophy around collective intelligence and seeing the team as an organism. We talk about organizations, but that's what they are, aren't they? They're a building of people, but they become an organization because of the people. So it's something that lives and breathes as one. And I also lean on the examples from previous chapters, because as I mentioned before, because we're talking about people, and there's a lot of crossovers in this. So we've got the Tim Payne examples. We've got quite a few references with regards to Sir Alex Ferguson, which I leaned on from Quinton Fortune and Kieran Richardson, who played under Sir Alex Ferguson. Again, used quite a fair amount from Tim Payne at KPMG. And I'll share this bit actually from Michael Bill. Michael Bill now is a first team coach at Rangers with Steven Gerrard. Sao Paulo manager Rogério Ceni came over to England to visit the Brazilian players at Liverpool. He went for dinner with Lucas Leiva, Roberto Firmino and Philippe Coutinho. He mentioned to them that he liked the Liverpool under-23s coach, which was Michael Bill. The players spoke highly of me, and that's why Ceni decided to approach me to become his assistant manager at Sao Paulo. Ceni didn't tell me this story until I had been working for Sao Paulo for 2 months. He said that Lucas, Firmino and Coutinho all spoke about how I was with them on a personal level. They said my coaching was good, but my personal skills made the difference. Alex Inglethorpe and I both see personal skills as part of the coaching package and not separate. It's something that I have had to work on as I'm shy. Whenever you hear the discussions about the best managers, people often talk about man management. But what does that mean? When I take over a group, I put everyone's birthday in my calendar. Whenever I learn anything about them, I try to remember it. I don't remember that they have 2 boys and a little girl. I ask, how's the little ones? Or with the younger ones, I say, how's mum, dad? And make sure you say hello from me. So Billsy was talking about him being at Liverpool and getting a job based upon how he made players feel. So this was Coutinho, this is Firmino, Lucas Leiva, these top players. This isn't about, oh, you make it, you've got to do it through grit, you've got to do it this way. It obviously made a big impact because it was worth them speaking about it. And and I can't remember if this is in the book or if this is a conversation that I had with Billsy, but he also spoke about how he would use the walk from the training ground building to the pitch to have conversations with the different players and to check in. So these were regular conversations. And he also mentioned that he won't just say, "Oh, you're right," because we are conditioned to say yeah. So he would often have conversations that would span probably around 15 minutes or longer. Because when you have those conversations, that's when the person's more likely to open up and say, well, actually, yeah, mum's going through this, my brother that, or I'm feeling this. So these were little strategies that he applied to himself, and I think these were really important to share, and the successes. He didn't do it to get the move, but I feel that it's really important that we acknowledge that this is a part of the package, and he made a point of saying this is not separate. Coaching and management in football is coaching and management universally, but football locked it into this space. But the benefits, and as you would read from Tim Payne in KPMG in the corporate world, it's about, again, helping people to perform better, and you'll get to read about the impact it has on them. All right, under this heading, freedom to think. This is from Paul Mortimer. Paul Mortimer, his experience is unbelievable. So he's a qualified counsellor with loads of experience. He's a former footballer, played for Charlton, Villa, Crystal Palace. A coach, he coached Charlton ladies, he coached Wimbledon youth, he coached Arsenal youth, he coached Brentford's first team. Okay, heading, freedom to think. So still within the leadership chapter. I coached Jack Wilshere at Arsenal when he was 14 years old, but I can't take any credit for the player that he is. I never say this about players, but at 14, I knew he was going to be a superstar. He was too good, so good, that I used to play him centre-back, right-back, and play him right-wing. I would never play him centre midfield because he would get the ball from our keeper, run past everyone and score, which meant he wouldn't develop and neither would his teammates. So I played him in different positions to create different challenges and develop his understanding of the game so he could learn what the game looked like from various angles. I told Jack and his parents what I was doing and why, and they were okay with it. And I think this is brilliant because sometimes you might have a coach who's just doing stuff, but you don't involve the player, but it's the player that has to do it, or it's their life, you know, and if they don't understand it, then they can't be fully on board. And then you get this incongruence with, you know, it kind of damages the relationship. But I'll go into it more in terms of why it becomes an issue when we don't do these things. And I don't want to name players because, but actually I'll give you a situation that played out actually. Theo Walcott, I know Chris Waddle, and I'm just saying this because Chris Waddle's publicly criticised him and said that he wasn't really that smart. Issue when we don't do these things. And I don't want to name players because, but actually I'll give you a situation that played out actually. Theo Walcott, I know Chris Waddle, and I'm just saying this because Chris Waddle's publicly criticised him and said that he wasn't really that smart. And using the example that Mortz spoke about with Wilshere, is that because it was so easy for him to just literally take on the team and do everything, he created new problems by putting him in different positions. So it made him think about approaching problems in different ways. So football is a game about problem solving. Working from the neck down is traditional football practice and what I refer to as zombie training because we're not using our brain. Creating players that don't innovate within the moment, playing as though they do not have a brain. Paul Mortimer moved Jack Wilshere into different positions. I just realised I kind of just said this already. All right, so the next part is under the heading, what young players need. So I spoke to players that were tipped as next best thing. I spoke to Flo van den Einden. I hope I said that right, Flo. At the time, he was playing for Inter Milan and he's a Belgium international. I know he's moved now. Dusan Djajic, Hammarby and Sweden international. Riyad Saduku, who plays for FK Sarajevo and Bosnia international. Luca Urcolani again, who's at Manchester United and an Italian international. Besard Sabovic, who was at Djurgårdens in Sweden and Swedish international. Filip Djurgic, FC Copenhagen and Montenegro international. And Matthew Dennis, Arsenal and England youth international. So at the time, I think all these players were 18 or younger. And I said to them, what do you need to flourish? And either directly or indirectly, they said, I need my manager's support. So it's one thing whether we've got a way, whether it be the coach saying, I'm going to do it this way, or even me saying, well, actually, no, I think you should do it that way. But the players, if you're leading those players, they're telling you. Or if you ask them, they will tell you. And then I caught up with Chris Powell. So Chris Powell managed Charlton, Leicester, and he was coaching with England. And then towards the end, I spoke to Stefan Moore about his experiences at Aston Villa. And then, yeah, that's leadership in the Soccology book. 7 in the Soccology book is player premium. So this is a chapter which, I mean, it's probably the one I'm most passionate about, but it blew my mind when I came out of football and I set up a company in education, and I learned about pupil premium, which is a fund. I mean, those who work in education will know about this. It's a fund that schools get for people who are struggling academically or, you know, behaviourally. They're seen as vulnerable or at risk. Schools can get, I think it's around $3 to $4 grand per student, you know, if they're on free school meals. So schools get thousands upon thousands for these students, and on their website they've actually got to say how they spend the money. So sometimes you might see a school say, you know what, we got a tutor, you know, we paid this amount for the tutor, etc. But what I found so interesting was that football has a load of students that are from a pupil premium background, and they don't get this extra support. Football's like, you know what, you've got one more chance, you know, or you're out. And that's how they dealt with it. And I thought, wow, there's obviously a need, because the government are spending millions per year on pupil premium fund, but there's no player premium. And I don't mean that in terms of money, but in terms of an approach. And a lot of the time, these are people that, you know, they might be suffering trauma and it's playing out in behaviour, and they're from low income backgrounds. So in player premium, I highlight this, but I come from the aspect of, because it's a very wide conversation, honing in on what football benefits from and looking at, in a way, the toughest areas and gang culture. So I start by talking about how one of my friends pulled a gun on one of my other friends, and how it was such a normal part of the lifestyle that it wasn't even a big deal. So just to kind of give you an aspect, an insight of what young people, young players, the environment they're coming from, and that when you get someone shouting at you in your face, that yeah, you might get a change in body language, or maybe someone biting back because of, in a way, that's what they've had to do to survive. And I then speak to players who are from that background that people might not even realise, they might not even know about. So someone like Bradley Wright Phillips. I spoke to Moses Ashikodi. So Moses is someone who, he's known for bringing a knife out and going for a player when he was at Millwall. But when you read about his story in this book, it's full of you know, neglect and abandonment and all this other stuff. And sometimes people say, oh, you know what, you're making excuses. But I think for me, that's probably the most powerful story in this book. So I'm not going to spoil it and read it for you. And it is long, but you need to read it. Trust me. But just to kind of give you just a little bit of insight, he came to this country as a 7-year-old from Nigeria. When he landed here, his brother went to prison, so he was in a country where he knew no one. By the time he was 9, he was earning £250 a week on the streets. By 13, kicked out of school, went into train at Millwall full-time. By 15, he was playing first-team football for Millwall and playing for England. And then trouble started to happen. And then at one stage, he had Bayern Munich and Barcelona that wanted him as well. But you can read that and find out. And then we spoke. Then in this chapter, I look at being brought up in certain areas. Obviously, there's people that have suppressed emotions and how it plays out. But Gökhan Inler shared a story where he said, when I was about 15 years old, I intercepted the ball aggressively in a very difficult one-on-one situation on the pitch. Everyone was so impressed. I had no idea that I could use my use my aggression to be successful in football. Since that day, I have channeled my aggression through my performances on the pitch to achieve success. express myself and feel good. So I think this is really important. For me, I feel the emotion of anger gets mismarketed massively in life. So to have something where you can utilize it, especially if you've got a build up of it, because we feel angry, or we have aggression anyway. But when you come from a certain background, you've got this pent up, you suppress this aggression. You need to unleash. So football gives that to many people. I also draw on comparisons with Mike Tyson, and Mike Tyson's story I use as a great example of attachment theory, because literally not feeling safe, having no one to attach to from childhood, having his coach, attaching to his coach, being successful, coach dying, and then regressing back to what he was before. So even though I'm moving this way, I should be doing that. So he regresses back to childhood as a man, and all the things he was doing. So he was taking drugs and breaking into homes at 10 and 11. So even though he wasn't breaking into homes and stuff, he started to take drugs again. He wasn't training, and that was purely because he lost his attachment. So, and I say this because, again, coaches can sometimes, traditionally, and I know it still happens now, but not as much, but they could easily say, you know what, you. But when someone signs at a club, it becomes a relationship. So it's like, how can we make this work? And you have to be honest with yourself and say if you're willing to invest the emotional currency that's required. Because it might be a case of, okay, this player has a certain level of need, but my circumstance doesn't allow that, because, for example, I might not be in the job within a few months, or, do you know what, I just don't want to. But at least you're being honest to yourself, and then you can save your time and the player's time. But if you choose to get into that relationship, it becomes a relationship. Yeah, and I share a story about a player that I played with that's in prison up to this day. There's players that I know who are in prison for armed robbery. Yeah. So with regards to player premium, that is something that, as I said, that's something that's really close to my heart, purely based on where I grew up. I grew up around gangs with my friends. All my friends were in gangs. And when I work at clubs or when I work in schools, and I always say that it's not so much a choice. I grew up with my classmates, my teammates, my mum's friends' sons. So I was surrounded by it. I'm not going to go into why I didn't follow down that route, but the bottom line is that people are a victim of their circumstance, and football benefits from that. They have satellite centres in those areas, so it's really important. It's great that there's this opportunity of football, but it's really important that we acknowledge the relationship and the responsibility from both parts. So we are on chapter 8, football relationships in the Soccology book. In this chapter, I look at different types of relationships. So looking at the relationship with the player and agent, with family and player, with the coaches and players, but also the relationship with the game and how it's affected with time. So, for example, whereas traditionally players were allowed to fall in love with football because they could be bored. Yes, social media is a part of that, which interrupts the relationship, but also fear from parents and public spaces becoming private, so there's no access. So when you've got the fear of parents allowing their kids to play out, the ones who can play out have no one to play with. When I was growing up, we got chased off of public places, private places by the police, because we weren't allowed to train on there, but we just loved football so much that we needed somewhere to train. So it looks at these relationships. So I think one of the biggest things that's affected football in recent years is data. So I talk about first seeing David Bentley in the academy when he played against Charlton when I was there, but playing against the younger age group, and how he exited the game and just retired because he had enough of what inspired him coming out of the game, the type of players that were getting lost, and how they were now measuring how far he run instead of the things that he was creating. And I've got this, under this heading called Not the Whole Story, I give an example about data and how it doesn't tell the whole story. In a 4-year cycle, the fox population in northern Canada goes from a high to near extinction, only to spike and eventually return to its original high. The cycle repeats itself continually And the story wouldn't give a biologist much to work with if they were to focus on the foxes alone, as there would be nothing to explain the variation in population. Open up the research to include the relationship of foxes to others, however, and you'll see the bigger picture. In this case, the foxes' relationships with rabbits. The foxes survive by eating rabbits, and the rabbits have no other enemy in the habitat yet, like the foxes. They get to the point of almost dying out, only to have a spike eventually to return to their original maximum population numbers. Marrying the cycle of the foxes and rabbits together reveals the same pattern in the opposite direction. When there are more foxes, they kill and eat more rabbits. This reduces the rabbit population and means less food for the foxes. Less food for the foxes leads to an increase in the fox deaths, which gives rabbits more time for procreation and survival. So the rabbit population increases. This in turn provides more food for the remaining foxes, so the fox population then spikes towards its original high and the cycle continues. My point is this: data can only tell you so much. It's a story but not the whole story. So with footballers, and I use a story that, or a comment should I say, that Gerard Piqué spoke about. He said, if you were only going to look at data, then Andres Iniesta wouldn't be the top player in the world, top attacking midfielder in the world. Because even though he scored goals and he created loads of assists, he didn't score many goals. I don't know about his assist record, but we can all say that he's one of the most amazing midfielders who have played the game. So data, it has its value, but there are some clubs who I know for a fact have been over reliant on it, and they're actually making their transfers based on data. So yeah, we go into the role of family. I was saying before, agents, and I think one of the stories for me, which was quite upsetting, was when Stefan Moore shared his experiences, or I should say his experience at QPR. So he spoke about breaking through at Aston Villa, playing under John Gregory. So John Gregory knew him. Stefan eventually moved to QPR. The first team manager there didn't play him. Now, when John Gregory became manager of QPR, he dropped Stefan and said, I heard you got an attitude. And this is a really big thing in football, that yes, there are issues that happen in football. And I gave this example in States where players can sometimes ruin their own game, but it's a mismanagement of emotions, etc. But there's also this gossip culture where coaches might, one, not take accountability, or two, they just form a judgment anyway, and they could ruin someone's career. Now, the staff at QPR would obviously said something to John Gregory, but the reason why this was such a big deal for me is because I thought, wow, this is a first where you actually know the player, but you're going off of hearsay, you know? So again, players' careers get ruined, but also I think that if you are a coach in the know, you could actually benefit from the downfall of other coaches. I wouldn't even say downfall, I suppose. Probably misjudgment, you know? Okay, well, if you think that, okay, I'll take him. And that's the end of that chapter 9 in the Soccology book, off-field decision-making. So I'm not going to read so much the actual words in this one, but I speak about I'll start with Stephen Cook. So he was a player my age, unbelievable, played for England, played for Walsall. At the age of 14, moved from Walsall to United, and he made that decision because he supported United. And then that ended up causing a big hoo-ha when he wanted to leave. And after 2 years, because he made a decision based on staying at Lilleshall, the centre of excellence, and not having to be in Manchester, only in school holidays. But because he's from the Midlands, he wanted to return back to the Midlands after his 2 years in the centre of excellence. But Sir Alex Ferguson was like, we really want to sign you. The club were really pushing to re-sign him. But he couldn't just leave and sign for who he ended up signing for, Villa, because he was under the age of 24. So that means the club owned his registration and Villa would have to pay for him. So it became a really drawn out and stressed out situation. So I break down the scenario in this book, but I highlight the need for players to be empowered and to learn about football, because we always talk about, you know, career decisions about careers in terms of after you leave the game, but we don't talk about the decisions and how to assess which moves you should take. And I think that's so key. I mean, he had to make some really important decisions at the age of 14. And yes, agents are there to advise, but I think they should be there. The agents and the coaches should be there to empower, because a lot of coaches played the game. So looking at, okay, if you're going to make a move, okay, what things do you look at? So stability of the club, of the manager, because if the manager brings you in, then he goes, then another manager might not favour you. So we're looking at all these other aspects to do with decision making, but off the field. I also speak about working with some of the top English talent and their personalities. Now this one, I didn't interview them for the book, but I've delivered programs, for example, at say Arsenal, Man City, with Reece Nelson, Joe Willock, Marcus McGrain, who's now at Barcelona, Eddie Nketiah at Man City when Jadon Sancho was there, when Phil Foden's still there. And it's just little things that looking at arrogance, but a good way, because we all talk about it in a negative way, looking at personalities and those who are more humble. And what I talk about in this is actually it's about balance. So I look at the current generation, the former generations of player, and looking at the types of personalities that they have. I also go through a process called neurological levels, and this process, which I think is really, really powerful, and this is just literally for people to have a greater understanding of what's going on, because I think sometimes you think, I'm working so hard, but things aren't working out for me. Is there something bigger than me that's affecting me? Now, the reason why I say that is because, again, this feeds into culture. It does feed into culture, but I highlight the religious war. So that's what it was called in Italy, with regards to what I was mentioning before about Bergkamp when he went from, Ajax to Inter Milan. So that is for you to read. I'm not going to go into that one.